Thank you very much indeed, both to Tim and Matthew. Hopefully you can all see the screen. Is that okay?
Yes, we can see the first screen.
Excellent. Good. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for the invitation to come along and have a conversation with you this afternoon. I won't call it anything as grand as a presentation because these are just a few thoughts. So yes, this is not. This is really some thoughts that I have rather than a sort of formal set of sort of well-honed themes and discussions, but I'm really excited that there are so many people on the webinar. I was, when Tim put up the sort of numbers that have been involved in these discussions, it really was quite something to behold, and I was very impressed with that. Now, although I'm reasonably familiar with what goes on in the UK from being involved in the UK scene for many years, I now have much more of an international perspective on things, and really what I wanted to do was give a bit of context about the global context within which land management is being discussed. I'm not an expert on this at all, but I am going to give you a very broad overview of some of the key things that are going on internationally. And I think that the first point I really want to make is that the UK is connected. You know, this is your discussions about land management are not happening in isolation from a massive global agenda, and there are many ways in which the agendas are connected, not least through the whole business of global trade and some of the sort of major crises of our time. So the first slide is showing you something called the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I hope that virtually everybody on the webinar has come across the Sustainable Development Goals, but I just wanted to talk about that because it's incredibly important context. So back in 2015, the world moved on from something called the Millennium Development Goals and agreed a new global agenda taking us up to 2030 about sort of prosperity for people and the planet. That's basically what the Sustainable Development Goals agenda is about. It's an integrated, indivisible, coherent agenda which kind of tries to describe the overall trajectory of the global community towards sustainability in the medium to long term. So there are 17 goals which you can see here on the slide, which are sort of succinct and which kind of cover a huge level of ambition for a better quality of life for both the planet and for the people who live in it. And those 17 goals are underpinned by 169 targets, most of which are reasonably smart and measurable and time-bound. Not quite all of them, but most of them are measurable and quite ambitious in many cases. And those targets in turn are measured by a framework of 232 indicators, which are overseen by the UN Statistics Commission, and which are subject to annual scrutiny at a major forum in New York every July, which is coming up. It's called the High Level Political Forum. So this global agenda is now signed up to. It's not a treaty, it's not a convention, but it's an international agreement, and all countries are, in their own particular ways, trying to take this globally agreed agenda for a new roadmap for prosperity for all, for people and planet, and trying to translate that into national action through their own sustainability plans. So that's the way in which the Sustainable Development Goals appear in the form of that diagram. However, I mentioned that the Sustainable Development Goals are very much an integrated agenda. That is part of what makes them very special. But the 17 separate icons in a grid like that don't really give the full flavor. So some very knowledgeable and brainy people at the Stockholm Resilience Institute redrew the 17 logos of the Sustainable Development Goals into this so-called wedding cake diagram, which I quite like, because it puts the biosphere-related goals around water, climate action, life on land, and life below water absolutely as being the underpinning goals for which on which everything else depends. Without a healthy biosphere, we won't have a healthy society and a healthy economy. So this diagram, I think, shows very clearly that the land, the core global resource that we have, and indeed the oceans, is critical to, and a healthy biosphere is critical to the underpinning of those goals, and that's really, really, really important. Now, this looks all very nice and coherent and sort of intellectually, what we would like to see, but I think it probably at this level, certainly at the goals level, it masks some quite interesting tensions when you get down to the level of targets, because some targets, in the way that they're expressed, do create the necessity to consider at national and indeed global level trade-offs. I mean, you think about the issues of protected areas, you think about the desire to protect biodiversity, and you set that against the fact that there are targets around increasing the revenue and livelihoods of smallholder farmers, and they need to feed a world that's of ever-growing number of people. So there are clearly some tensions there, and some what we call trade-offs. But there are also what we in rather jargonistic terms call synergies. Many of the goals work together, and if we can deliver on one goal, we can deliver on multiple goals at the same time. So there's a massive body of evidence that is now being built globally through the UN system about how all of the goals are intricately linked together, and that delivering on on these in a coherent and indivisible way is really critical. So that's a little bit of a background about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's going to be really important because Matthew's going to talk about that in his presentation in a moment, in a very much in a UK context. And I'm sure most of you are already very familiar with that background. But I wanted to also just mention that, in terms of the global perspective, there are some pretty staggering and pretty horrific statistics out there. And a lot of you will have come across IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's a long title. It has basically, IPBES aspires to be the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for biodiversity and ecosystem services and the environment, effectively. It's trying to build this body of evidence to make sure that we understand fully the science behind the actions that we need to take, particularly in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in 2018, IPBES published a global land degradation assessment, and the statistics really speak for themselves. Food production uses 50% of the habitable land in the world. 10 million people by 2050 are projected to exist, and that will mean up to a 50% increase in food production. How are we going to squeeze that out of the finite land resource we have? The land that is used, very much, a lot of it is degraded. There is a whole UN convention on combating desertification, which focuses very much on degraded land globally. Land degradation affects 29% of global land and 3.2 billion people, well over a third of the world's population at the moment. We have the pace of deforestation is slowing, as the recent Food and Agriculture Organization Global Assessment on Forests showed, but it's still continuing. So we have forest degradation as well as agricultural land degradation. We have increasing demands on urban by urbanization for land at a global level. We have a massive deficit in terms of freshwater withdrawals. Agriculture is very demanding that has massive implications for the extent of freshwater resources. And over a period of a couple of centuries, we've lost nearly 10% of soil organic carbon across the globe. So there are some major issues in terms of the state and the stock and the quality of the land that we have at a global level. And some of those issues in a microcosm obviously affect us in the UK too. But I didn't want to dwell too much on some of those fairly stark facts, and IPBES is extremely good at not only presenting the state of various dimensions of the environment, whether it's looking at these thematic assessments on land degradation or biodiversity or ecosystem services and pollination and so on, but it is also very good at kind of describing in often quite simple terms some of the complexities of transformative change in terms of global systems that we need to effect in order to move us towards those sustainable development goals and the Agenda 2030. So the UN has declared 2020 to 2030 the decade of action on the sustainable development goals, which basically means that the UN system is focusing on accelerating many of the pathways to positive change and solutions to try and address the Agenda 2030. We also have a specific decade focused on ecosystem restoration, 2021 to 2030, and there's a massive program of action and awareness raising and solutions-focused guidance emerging in response to that UN decade. And then, of course, we also have what should have been a biodiversity super year, or climate and biodiversity super year in 2020. Both the major global meetings on biodiversity and climate have obviously been postponed into 2021, but the bringing together of the climate and nature agenda has been an incredibly prominent part of the UN dialogue in terms of this current year and the coming years ahead. And a lot of that is expressed in terms of things like the dialogue on nature-based solutions, using working with nature and the services that it provides to kind of to address and improve the societal challenges such as climate change and land degradation. So this is where we get into some really interesting co-benefits. I mean, land is really at the core of all of this action, whether it's restoration of ecosystems, of forests, of coastlands, wetlands, tackling climate adaptation, climate mitigation, tackling biodiversity loss. Land is a common thread across all of these initiatives. And there are lots of ways in which we can start to think about sort of co-benefits, where your land is providing a way of achieving multiple objectives at the same time. So if we're talking about agroforestry, where agriculture and forestry can work together to deliver multiple benefits, we're talking about the carbon and the protecting nature agenda. There are lots of synergies there. We're talking about protected areas, but also an expansion of those, but also the way in which those protected areas can relate to livelihoods of people. So there's lots of co-benefits where land can bring together sort of and catalyze, sustainable land management can catalyze a lot of the action that we want to see. And my last slide is just really to bring this back down to a UK level a little bit. So I mentioned that the high-level political forum, which is the main kind of governance by which the SDGs are reviewed at a global level within the UN system, countries are invited to and encouraged to present voluntary national reviews of how they're doing in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. And last year, the UK prepared a fairly comprehensive, nearly 200-page voluntary national review of how it perceived it was doing towards the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's some interesting text in there around the challenges of environmental land management, which I've just put up there as a quote to give you a little bit of context. And although the language that we use in the UK is about sort of public benefits, public goods, we're talking very often about the the same things as ecosystem services and nature's contributions to people, which kind of are more globally used terms to describe some of the things that land, when sustainably managed, can provide to us. So the final point I just wanted to make was that I think where this sort of UK versus global dimension comes in is that I think our choices in the UK about how we manage our land are not done in isolation. We're not an island. Very often the decisions we make about the farming systems, the timber production systems, the way which we manage our land have very, very strong overseas implications. We're not only contributing to global efforts for sustainability, and not only are we able to export the expertise that we have abroad, and hopefully we can also receive expertise from overseas. There are some great examples that the UK could also learn from. And in terms of the trade and the sort of global trade and the choices that we make as consumers, those often affect land management decisions overseas in terms of, our consumption of products like cocoa or palm oil or soy or whatever, and the impact that we have as consumers on land management and sustainability overseas is sometimes called telecoupling, but it's nonetheless it's a hidden, but it's a hugely impactful way in which we have impacts on what happens overseas almost without realizing it. I think I've probably spoken for far too long, so I will stop there and hand over to Matthew, I think.